So official.
I know.
We should do that. Hey Kathy, you set it up that it's automatically always Angie's voice.
Then she'll want to get paid because she thinks.
Royalties every time they go off.
Right?
Maybe yes.
Hey Mike, how you doing? You look fully summarized.
30 years.
Grass,
I like it.
it's ridiculous right now.
How fast it's growing. I did mine Sunday and then Wednesday and it needed it.
It's ridiculous, and I'm leaving for a week, right now.
Oh.
I got a guy covered for me, years into
You
it.
still doing my neighbor Denny's?
Doing terrible, there's too many.
Pretty soon you're gonna have to be a business. All right, it is 5:30, so I will call this intergovernmental body to order. As I call it to order, it's the Waupun Common Council, the Waupun Fire and Police Commission, Dodge County Emergency Government, Fond du Lac County Emergency Government, towns of Chester, Waupun, Trenton, Elko, Oakfield, Springvale, Potomac, Brandon, and Oakfield. I know it's a beautiful Thursday evening and it was kind of short notice on this meeting of less than a month. So I really appreciate all of you who made the time to come out. And I'm very thankful the air conditioning is working properly. This is an important meeting to have to get the discussion going on the future of fire and EMS for both the city and the surrounding townships. As I'm sure you've seen me quoted in news articles and stuff, there's a bunch of things going on at the same time. One is the rising cost of fire equipment and the fact that we need a new aerial ladder fire truck. It's coming up on 30 years old. And the cost of that is up to $1.8 million and it never goes down. You've also seen how we operate on we call it a volunteer fire department. I guess the technical term is paid on call. The reality is it's a good group of people we have on that fire department, but it's getting harder and harder for us to get enough available firefighters to respond to fire calls, especially during the daytime working hours. The number of fire calls have gone up. The number of people who work in town has gone down, and the number of employers who are that willing to let employees leave as often as we're asking them to leave, the fire calls is going down. So it's to the point, and BJ knows the numbers better than I do. I don't know how many we need to show up at a fire, but we don't have enough people showing up to attack a fire if we ever had a serious situation in the middle of the day. The other thing you've seen is we have the EMR program that started here in the city. They're first responders, they're volunteers from the city. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. And one of the things we've seen there is our local contracted ambulance service stays pretty busy. And we have a rising number of 911 ambulance calls. There isn't an ambulance available. We had 2 a week ago, a 911 EMS calls where Waupun first responders showed up and they stayed on site with the people in need for 20 minutes until an available ambulance showed up from outside of the city. I personally think the vast majority of people in Waupun, when they call 911 for an ambulance, want one to show up within a few minutes. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. So these are the challenges we're facing as a city, and as our fire department and ambulance service is coexisting with the surrounding towns, it's important that we all get on the same page and figure out how we're going to go moving forward, because these are the real issues and the costs are such that it's getting really hard for the city to take care of it all. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kathy to start on the discussion of the agenda.
Nice setup, thank you. I don't really need to build on that, I don't think. You're probably all experiencing some of what the mayor has been talking about. Not a local problem by itself, certainly a statewide problem and a national problem at that, if you follow the headlines and the news stories that are out there. So tonight, this is about hearing at this point, and what I really want to accomplish tonight, and I want it to be a dialogue, so if you have questions, I would love it if you ask. And we have some dialogue, But very much, we want you to understand, what are we doing and what brought us to this point where we decided this was our best path forward. So you got the agenda. It's gonna flow from one to the next. This is not gonna be a formal meeting, because it's really more important that we have the dialogue and we share with you what we're trying to accomplish. But we did commission a study with PAA, and we'll do the introductions to the gentleman here in a little bit. But factors that brought us to this point really are data informed. So in 2018, 2019, I said to Chief DeMa, who's accountable for the ambulance? And I had been in the role for like a year, I think, at that point. He's like, well, I don't know, like, who is? There wasn't a lot of data being tracked, so we didn't have a good understanding of the performance, and we made a very significant turn. So you'll start to see that we have a lot of information, some of it the strongest probably since 2019. We know a lot more on the fire side, obviously, because that's directly our staff. So we've spent a lot of time analyzing the data already, and there's some trends here that are very concerning to us. So from an objective perspective, fact finding, analyzing alternatives is part of the goal here. Understanding structures and costs associated with those things. And frankly, I don't know about you, but I'm going to be a grandma soon. And I hope that future generations don't worry about this problem. I don't want them to be having this conversation. We want to go in kind of eyes wide open and figure out what's the best alternative forward to ensure sustainability of this service. So our goals, as they're really outlined in our agreement with PAA, is to evaluate and recommend staffing structures that improve reliability of both fire and EMS. It's interesting because we've got two different boundaries that we're working with, so we're going to have to understand what that all means. Engage the community in discussions to assess levels of expectations. So as the mayor said, you would assume people call 911, they want an ambulance to show up. I would assume that too, but what do people really think? And that would include the townships. It's really important that we hear from you as well. What are the budget implications? How do we work together cooperatively to make this a better system? And then what does it mean to facilities and other things that we are having to be concerned with as we move forward? Any questions about that before we get into some of the key trends that caused us to get to this point? Let's look at a little bit at why. If you look over the last 10 years, this is an interesting trend slide. If we narrowed it into the last 3 years, it looked like it's up and down and not a lot of variability. So you have to consider that our operating systems are the same operating systems that they were, I don't know for how long, but certainly for the 10 years we've been operating with the same number of staff and the same on-call, paid on-call model. But the calls have increased 2.5 times over that time period. And most recently, around 17, 18, up in there is where we saw it peak, and it's been fluctuating a little bit, but it remains fairly high and about 2.5 times more than maybe what history has said could be managed by the team of people that we have. BJ, I don't know if there's anything you want to add related to just the nature of the calls.
Yeah, I would say it's a changing dynamic of, if it's not something that pertains directly to medical, so your EMS folks or police, the fire department is usually who ends up getting called to try and figure out what's going on and how to resolve it. I've said for quite some time, I think we do ourselves a bit of a disservice by calling ourselves a fire department, because it's not the primary thing we do. It's so much more than that. We've transitioned into a all hazards department, and that's truly the scope of what we respond to throughout the course of a year.
Can you give some examples of what those other things are?
Yeah, I mean, it's car accidents, car fires, fire alarms. Everybody chuckles. Do you rescue cats out of trees? We've had those. We do have animal rescues that take place, missing persons. We have a lot of different equipment that we bring to the fight, if you will. So there's a lot of other agencies that will call for support on different types of calls that, some of our equipment may be beneficial to have there.
Well, and last winter we had someone fall through the ice.
Yep, ice rescue is another one, another good example, hazardous material spills, control, cleanup, different things like that.
And storms.
Yep.
So I would assume you're all experiencing some of that as well. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's real for us, certainly.
Oh, I guess one other thing that I would throw in there too is a lot of departments, as we start to struggle with staffing, mutual aid becomes a very important part of that. So we see a lot more mutual aid, a lot more auto aid, where, just to be able to try and muster enough people for an initial fire attack or whatever the call requires from a staffing standpoint, there's a heavy reliance on neighbors coming in and assisting, because just departments as a whole, if you truly dig into the numbers, which is something we have done, departments as a whole are not fully staffing their departments anymore as their self.
So this chart, and I'm going to have BJ speak a little bit. He's been tracking responders, number of responders, and this is an average for each month. And it's about the last 15, 16 months here. You want to talk a little bit about what you're trying to measure against related to standards?
Yeah, so this is a really busy slide, and I do apologize for that, but it helps us be able to see, really looking at two separate timeframes. So when we think about, okay, people that go to work, maybe work in town, we tried to figure out what is a good time frame to be able to look at that data set. And really, we've kind of whittled it down to that 4 a.m. to 8 p.m. window for our staff that would work daytime or first shift hours. And then from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m., it was our thought, or at least going into tracking these numbers, my assumption was, okay, we should see more turnout during the evening hours than we do during the daytime hours. And really what we found is across the board, we're not seeing much of a difference anymore, whether it's a daytime call or a nighttime call. But we always go back to what are the standards. So within the fire service, everything that we look back on is through the National Fire Protection Association, or NFPA. And NFPA talks about what does it take personnel wise, how many people do you need to effect a offensive attack at a structure fire. So offensive attack means we're going to be entering the building, we're going to try and do a rescue, put out a fire, things like that. And they talk about a minimum of 15 firefighters. There's another agency out there called NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Their number is a little bit higher at 18. So those are the two benchmark numbers that we typically look at. And everything that you see here in red, these are months and time frames that we failed to meet that minimum of 15 responders for any given time period or any given month.
That's every month.
Yes.
It's every month on record, and it probably was happening before we started to track. But as I sat in my chair and was watching these monthly reports, I was pretty nervous because there's two other points that need to be made. So one theory would be, well, let's just increase the number of available paid on call people, because maybe we'll get enough to show up. We did do that. We took a step in 23, and the city's budget expanded to include 3 additional paid on call staff members. But we've not filled those spots. In fact, we didn't have enough applicants in the current recruitment process to fill those spots. So that's not to say if we didn't continue to try that we wouldn't, but there's training and everything that goes to trying to get people up to speed. So I know that we believe that the candidate pool is dropping in terms of people willing to commit volunteer time to do this work. The other thing that I've observed personally is the toll it's taking on our full-time staff. And I have to call it enough is enough. Some of you, or most of you probably are familiar that we did almost lose our fire chief last year. And thank goodness he's still here. But some of that is just the personal toll it's taking because of the demand on him personally as we try to fill some of these gaps, and that cannot continue, and I would boldly say that. So average responders right now, 10.4 in that 4 a.m. to 8 p.m. If you look across this time span, 11.1, so slightly better at night, but not enough to really meet the standards. And I'll say this, if you look at what's transpired in 23, those numbers dropped. So we have fewer responders in the last 4 months. We've seen some retirements, or there we talk about that when I look at demographics, but like the trends are not great for what we're talking about here. And so this is a factor in why we're going about trying to understand how does this need to look going forward. In my opinion, we cannot talk about fire without talking a bit about ambulance. Now in Waupun, this is a contracted service. Looks like my slide got messed up here, and I apologize for that. I'm gonna actually fix that because that's gonna loud at me. 1 second here. Let's put this over here. Okay. And so we don't have quite as good of information or as long of information as we did do on fire. And I want to note that I am missing complete data in 2019. We're working on trying to finish that out and get that updated. But if you look at the trend line, it's pretty clear that it's increasing ambulance call volumes as well. And then we look at what really, in the contract that we have with Lifestar, we've created some service standards. And it's expectations on how much they need to be on time. And you might think, well, if they're not on time and it's something significant, and it's my loved one, that's a big problem, because I think that. And we have seen that. So in 2022, of our ambulance calls tracked, and it's right around 1,400. And that number back in 2014 was just over 800. So you can see the call volume up. We had 51 calls, where essentially, well, it's really about a call a week, you might as well say. There's 52 weeks in a year, or 3.8% of the total calls where we experienced a service failure of some form. Either there was no ambulance in town and we had to call for mutual aid, or we had a delayed response time based on the contractual service standards. You see the little column on the right-hand side is EMRs. Provided greater than 10 minutes of care before an ambulance arrived. That is in 2022, because we saw this trend happening already in 2021. The city made a decision to add an EMR program. And I can tell you, I can cite at least one, and I'm sure BJ could cite many more calls where that team has saved the life in at least one case I know of. And made a huge difference in the outcome for the patient. And so we see a lot of value to that program, but I want to talk about demographics. Before I do that, BJ, anything you want to talk about related to types of calls or anything related to EMR performance for about a year, not quite a year in?
Yeah, I guess I would just comment on the significance of some of the calls that really precipitated us to get credit here in the city. You know, we've had individuals with having a cardiac event. We've had individuals that were having stroke-like symptoms, brain bleed, choking child, an instance where the police department, they were concerned enough that they ended up putting a patient in the back of their squad car and took him to the hospital. Because the Fond du Lac or the ambulance would have been coming from Fond du Lac. So it became a series of events that we were just seeing with more and more frequency that to delay care in certain situations can have very negative results for a patient in delaying care by 20+ minutes.
We had a good example of this earlier in the school year. At MVP, we had a student that had a seizure, right?
And there wasn't an available ambulance, so our EMRs stayed with that kid until an ambulance could come from Fond du Lac to take that poor kid 3 blocks up the street.
So this, again, we're starting to track data now with the startup in February of 22 of our EMR program. And you can see that probably averaging around 50 calls a month. We don't go into the Department of Corrections facilities. We've deliberately chosen to not do that. You know, I think
None of the
none
care
of the care
facilities,
facilities.
which would, so we add probably another 10 to 20 calls per month.
Yeah. So we're selective in how we're deploying the staff because they're volunteers. We have the ability to roster 15. We currently have 9 with an open recruitment process. And really no qualified or hardly any qualified applicants to get us to 15. So value, but again, this is one of the things because 2 of the 9 happen to be our chief and our assistant chief. So our resources are getting stretched in ways that they're not intended to be stretched, and they're not able to get things done that they otherwise would be able to get done if they weren't being pulled all these directions. So grave concern for the longevity of our staff and wanting to ensure that they have a good quality of life too. So it's a factor, and it's a second factor that we want to talk about. And then really just demographics of the roster overall. And this one I hadn't looked at before putting this together. And so let me kind of walk you through this because it's small and I apologize. But in my mind, I come out of a workforce development background. It's super important to look at the demographic makeup of your workforce because it's a fairly good predictor of where you're going to go next, who your leaders might be as you grow. In general, we have one person who is under 32 years of age on the force. We don't have anybody in their 20s right now. And I would say that, you know, overall, a bulk of the workforce is 35 and above, skewing higher. Average age of the firefighters is 43.5 years. The EMRs is 50.7. It's important to note that we've seen a lot of retirements in the last few years. So almost 43% of the roster has 5 or fewer years of service. And these aren't people who come and day in and day out, this is the job they're doing and they have a fast learning curve. The learning curve can be longer because they are part-time and they get training. We're really committed to that. We've invested in training resources, but it's not the same as this is my job that I go to every day and do. So anything you want to add about that, BJ?
Yeah, the demographics piece is key. You know, as we talk even about, there's different ways to try and dice the numbers up. So you can talk about, well, you know, how many people do you have total on your roster? That's a great number. However, how many people are active on that roster becomes another important discussion. We had talked about going from 30 to 33 firefighters this year. You know, what impact that'll have? Well, it depends on where those extra 3 people work, what their social calendar looks like. Fact of the matter is, you know, we've seen some of it's generational, but I think what we're starting to see, and I would lump volunteerism as a whole, if you look across America, this isn't a problem that's specific to just your fire departments, your EMS groups. Talk to your softball, baseball associations, talk to any of your sports leagues. They can't get help.
Lions Club.
Yep. So any of your organizations that rely on volunteers, they're all feeling the same pinch. And what we've seen is, if you go back 15, 20 years ago, where, you know, your family life kind of revolved around what the fire department was doing, it shifted in that now I'll do the firework, but it's going to fit around my schedule, my child's sports schedule, and there is just, it does not end. It's sports in school, it's sports in the summer leagues, it's travel teams, it is kids nowadays go sport to sport to sport to sport. And yeah, as a fire department, EMS, where do we fit in that schedule? And that's part of what we see is that people have a very strong value now on that time away from work, and they fill that schedule up.
There's another reason that I also want to just toss in, and I didn't put it here, but why we're talking about fire and ambulance together at this point. Because we're really trying to understand what are the potentials of a combined resource. With ambulance comes some revenue. Wait, I don't know what that means. I just know that it could be an offsetting factor. It's something we need to consider. The city was awarded 2 grants the COVID programs that were happening. So we actually have acquired 2 ambulances. One is used, one is really pretty new. I think it was a demo.
It's actually being built,
Oh, it's being built.
so it will be.
What do I know?
Double that's being built.
So we've been positioning ourselves with our EMR program to try and get at least to a backup position. And we cannot not think about this as we move forward. So I'm not here to say these things come together. Absolutely. I think we're trying to understand that. But I want you to know that we understand that there is that revenue component and we need to be thinking about that as we move forward. So we've contracted with Public Administration Associates. Gentlemen are here tonight. I'm going to have them do their introductions if you don't mind.
Hi, good evening. My name is Kevin Rudd. I'm the president of PAA. I've been around about 25 years and we're based in Oshkosh. Now we're based in Whitewater, but we do about half of our work is in municipal recruitment and selection. We were able to help the city last year with the finance and director and assistant administrators. That's how we came in contact with Kathy and the mayor. But we do have a pretty robust fire EMS consulting group, and we work all over the state and in that area. We also do a lot of other municipal consulting for townships, counties, cities, and villages. So in my background, I was a city manager for about 35 years, most recently in Whitewater.
Thank you. So the 2 lead consultants are here.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Chuck Butler. I am relatively new with PAA, but I'm not relatively new to the fire service and EMS business. I've been in this business for almost 40 years. Last private EMS, career fire, volunteer fire, emergency management. I've been in all of those areas. A couple of years ago, I retired as the assistant fire chief and the EMS service director for City of Sheboygan. So I'm actually really pleased to be able to get out and put some of that knowledge and experience to help other communities kind of take a closer look, because the world is becoming very dynamic in the fire and EMS industry, and it's time to really look some things in the face and ask some hard questions on how we provide those services. So it's pretty exciting to be able to do that, and looking forward to working with you all.
And my name is Tim Franz, and over 40 some years in the fire service also. Where I spent a good deal of my time was with the city of Oshkosh. I worked there for 33 years. I retired there 5 years ago. I was their fire chief for 18 years. I started working for PAA before that, and been doing more of this in my retirement, along with teaching at Fox Valley Technical College. And I started off in a small volunteer department, and as a kid, I was probably a dispatcher when I was 8 years old, because I was around before 911 and the fire phone rang in our firehouse, or in our house and things like that. So been around it my whole life and understand the dynamics of all the different types of service delivery models. And I was also the president of the state fire chief, so I have a lot of understanding and connection with folks all over the state. Just one thing I would like to add with that, in that statement, and the issues that you have are not unique. And folks think sometimes that they are. And by that, I mean the issues of struggling with staffing. And even career departments are struggling with that right now, as are all employers, but we're really seeing that in I would say in a lot of places in the state, not so much here, you're on your way, I think you're being proactive. We right now, we're working in 4 other communities, so that have very similar issues. Some of them are already into the extremely fragile state. They're 3 or 4 key people away from failure, because that's what they're down to. That's who they're relying on to respond 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's not sustainable. So I think you're in a good position looking down the road at this. I mean, if you're not, I'm not going to say everything's great, you know, but I'm not going to say that you're there. But those are issues that that are occurring in a lot of places. How we approach this is, I can't tell you what the answers are yet. We do it from a research-minded standpoint. We come in not having preconceived ideas of what needs to be done. Our first step is to gather information and analyze all this data. And one of the things that we're going to do is then benchmark that data compared to national standards, trends in the state. How are you doing according to the standards, what it takes? What does the community expect? As far as response times and the numbers of people that you're going to be there. And I'll tell you, one of the things that's changed is a lot of people understood how government worked and where your services came from. You might be surprised, you could survey people in this city and they don't realize that you have a paid on call fire department, possibly even. They just, all they know is when they call 911, they expect and that's all we're mainly concerned about. So we try to get that information together, and then looking at where that is, and then the next step is that what are the expectations of the community and what are the national standards? You know, like some of those things might be that, as Chief was pointing out, there's a couple different NFPA, National Fire Protection Standards, that, you know, and we turn those into what we call key performance indicators. So that if the expectation is that when somebody calls 911 for a fire emergency, that we're going to put at least 10 people on the scene there in 10 minutes. That's NFPA standard 1920. What's it going to take? What kind of fire department is it going to take to be able to deliver that level of service? What kind of ambulance service is it going to take? What kind of staffing will it take to get an ambulance on scene in less than 2 minutes, 90% of the time? At what level of care? Those types of things. And then said, what would it take? What kind of staffing would it take to do that? And then last but not least, and one of our, the person that started this company, he trained me well. He said, we don't do a good job on this in government. Usually we just say, we're going to spend this amount of money. He said, it should be like a menu in a restaurant. You tell everybody what you're going to get and then what it's going to cost. Because if you say, do you want $5 or $10 worth? Okay. And then, but it is true, that is a factor. What is then some estimate on what this is going to cost? And build it around that and give you different options. So this kind of, I summarized in a nutshell what we're going to be doing for you.
Thank you. So I know we have some folks from the county, and I just want to address both sides for the city of Waupun. In Fond du Lac County, and it spills into some of the Dodge County townships, those 2 individuals couldn't make it tonight. We started just before COVID, we started this conversation on the idea of consolidating our country and our city fire services. And it got put on hold because we lost a staff person and COVID happened, and the rest is history. We're back to having the conversation. That conversation will happen as part of this study. And then in Dodge County, there is a discussion about countywide service and the possibility of that, what that might look like. I have no idea. But as I said in my email, I'm of the mind that what we're doing to strengthen ourselves will complement what the county ultimately decides to do, if anything. Dodge County is a big area with a big marsh in the middle, making it hard to serve. And so, we're game for working in parallel and in partnership with the county. This doesn't preclude that conversation. I just want to say that. Can't tell you how they're going to fit together, but we'll work through that. So here's really the process. So we held a kickoff meeting in April with our own internal team and have started to gather a lot of the information and send it over to the gentleman at PAA. During the month of May and maybe possibly to the beginning of June, there's going to be a series of interviews with our own elected officials, as well as with all of you. So we're hoping that if you signed up tonight, you're going to get a call or an email from us indicating that we want to schedule time. And we're not asking for a ton of time, but we need feedback as to your perspective on this issue, what's working, what's not working, et cetera. We will do community surveys. And that gets to trying to understand expectations of the service itself, because that'll inform what we do going forward. The big chunk of time over the summer where we're doing a lot of analysis and trying to look at what are the alternatives and developing ultimately models and budget implications. Once we get to that point, we get this into a report, that's probably going to be a reconvening time for this group to talk about what did this tell us? What might we want to do going forward? How do we want to approach this? We'll be in budget time. We'll understand maybe what the state budget is or is not going to do for our revenue picture. So a lot will change between now and then. But I see that being really the next point where we come together. However, any questions you have along the way, I want to hear from you. So I have cards, I'm happy to give them to you. Please reach out. Randy is not shy, he will reach out, I know that.
No.
But anything else you guys would like to say about the process itself?
I would just like to say one thing. I know we've been hired and for doing this work for the city, but we commend you for being proactive, because there can be some significant return on investment on what you might spend, hiring us. And I'll tell you a quick story. 2 years ago, Platteville, City of Platteville hired us, and they knew they needed a new fire station, which was part of it, but they also needed to look at their staffing and a number of other performance benchmarks for their department. So we completed a report. We did work with an architectural firm to look at the space needs analysis, and we presented that report. Based on that report, they were able to garner a $7 million federal grant to build a new facility in Platteville. And that was never in our wildest imagination when we were doing that study. We thought it would result in that, but because of that study, they had all the information to present. They were able to garner a $7 million federal grant to assist them with expanding their fire EMS service. So I just want to tell you that there could, there's a benefit to being proactive. And where this leads us, we're not sure. We're very data driven. It's all going to be based on what we learn from the data and from all of you. But at the end of the day, we hope we come up with some very practical and implementable solutions to services.
Questions? Heard us deal with a lot of stuff. Is this consistent with what we've been experiencing, regardless of the service you're using? Some of your fire, some of your fire and ambulance, some of your just ambulance. Consistent with what you're seeing. So this is, I should have done introductions, and I'm sorry. Maybe we can do that quickly, a little backwards, but I think it's important to understand who's all in the room. Would you mind?
Sure. I'm Trina with Oakfield Fire. I'm the EMS captain. I'm Tracy with Oakfield Fire, and I do both fire and EMS.
So, right, in this particular conversation, ambulance is a factor for Oakfield.
Mike Beer, Assistant Chief of Fire.
Randy Benison, Town Chairman, Waupun.
Will Peterson, Supervisor, Town Chairman.
Very nervous, supervisor. And Mike Zimmer, President, Police Fire Commission for Waupun.
Guys in the back.
Dave Gutenberger, County Board.
Joe Mater, Dodge County Emergency.
Randy Davis and Dutch County Board.
Pete Kazmarski, City of Waupun, second ward, common council.
Dan Severs, Fifth Ward Common Council, City. PJ Demott, Fire Chief.
Ron, the mayor.
So you get a feel, we don't have everyone here tonight, I do have this recording, so I'm going to push out. A link so you can access the information and share it with your colleagues if you would. So everyone knows kind of where we're at and where we're headed. Other comments, questions?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, Joe, if you can comment where Dodge County is since our last meeting about a month ago and how that might change this process or would not change the process.
So we've been having continued discussions since a study done in 2017 indicating exactly what we knew, but also providing us some guidance. That also included and probably stuck out the most is consolidation of services or maybe better known as cross credentialing of EMTs to cover areas is to include consolidation or combining of EMS services to better work your resources. When I say we had 4 to 5 meetings prior to November of last year, and we didn't gain a lot of input from those meetings. They were attended, but there were a lot of crickets in the room, and I think people have some ideas of what are some possibilities. But I don't know that they verbalize them. We had a meeting of elected officials about 3 weeks ago and had a very good turnout. And I think it kind of opened the eyes of some of the elected officials that are saying, you know, EMS, how you doing? We're doing great. We're low on people, but we're getting along. And there may be that certain point where the elected official needs to kind of dig a little deeper into it and say, you are having problems, and I'm hearing that. Where are your problems, and really, how much are you contributing? Because we've got people in the county that are probably running 65 to 75% of those calls a year on some of the services. They are being run tight, and again, we didn't get any good. We got good feedback that we know there's a problem. We got feedback that we know that it's hard to hire people, but no real good conceptual. I think leaving that meeting a few weeks ago, a survey came kind of to topic and sending out a survey for at least some feedback about it might be easier for people to air some of their thoughts through a survey. So that is something that we're working on. One of the consolidated service as a first responder fire service down in the southwest part of our county, being the CLR, which is a high service time and refill. They combined, and I think it's taken them about 6 years now to actually become the official CLR unit. And they've had some growing pains, but I think they are moving in the right direction. What it did do is brought more people to the call, but it didn't necessarily bring more volunteers. So everybody's pager is going off in that entire area, and they're all responding to the one location. Where in the past, they respond with one fire department, realize that they only had 3 people, and then go and request 8 other departments. So I don't know that the consolidation down there really, it didn't draw people up to the board and start signing up. I like some of their thoughts, and I like some of the structure that they've created. And actually myself and our county administrator Clapper met with the chief over there and another individual from their department today, kind of discussed the structure and how they built it. So that might be something that is coming down the line, and maybe a presentation on how they did it, how it looks, and if it's something, a model that maybe we could use for the rest of the company.
So can I ask a question? I was at the Peter and after at the meeting 2 weeks ago. Why do you think you said a couple times you get crickets in previous meetings. Why do you think that is?
There's an incredible amount of pride between services.
Okay, thank you. That's, we got a big sense of that, but the night we were there. And when we talked on the way back, and our, part of the goal of this process is to be very open upfront. And drive the fear out of the process upfront, because if we don't do that, we're not gonna win, right? If we don't win together, we don't win anyway. And that's what we kind of sense. There's a lot of pride and a little bit of protectiveness thought going on, so.
Yeah, so if I don't say anything, then they're not even gonna, they're just gonna pass over me and we're good, we're getting along, we're making 99% of it.
Yeah, so trying to not have focus fall on them because they're fearful of the county thoughts, right?
Right.
Well, and I guess I was part of the committee that met before the big group came back together again, and I would say there were a lot of agencies that did not participate in those discussions either. Some of the departments that were actually worse off staffing wise than some of those that were in attendance. So it's got to be a process that everybody engages in. I can tell you in the next 10 years, how we see or know fire and EMS today, it is going to look completely different.
Agree with that. All you have to do is look at high school enrollments. You know, schools that have declining enrollment for the last 20-ish years. We are not at replacement population here. And so the bodies are not there to fill the jobs that need to be filled, volunteer or otherwise. It's just simple math, frankly. So we need to be real about that, in my opinion, and we need to start to say, okay, what's this service gonna look like? Because again, down the road, I don't want future generations to be saying, what were they thinking? Why were they not talking about this? We have hard decisions to make, no doubt. But I think if we can get the data and we can start to talk about what are we willing to do, we can get to a different future. What that looks like, it'll be determined through the process. So I think we have to trust the process and ask lots of really good questions as we go through the process. That's all I have, unless anyone has anything else they want to say.
If I could just add one thing before we dismiss Kathy, not next week, Wednesday, the following Wednesday, May 24, up at University of Oshkosh at the Whitburn Center from 5 to 7 p.m. The Wisconsin State Fire Chiefs put out a questionnaire probably about 2 months ago that really was looking for more information as it related to fire districts across the state and a true district in that it has taxing authority. There will be a conversation and a panel discussion. Like I said, May 24 from 5 to 7 p.m. up at UW Oshkosh. So I would encourage folks, if you've got time to attend that, to sit in on it.
I can send that link out. Okay. I think we're gonna look for environment.
Cool, and this is the actual meeting, so I guess I'll just declare it adjourned. Thank you all for coming. If you go next door, the next one to reach from Randy Vaniswan. He's not a favorite.